whenever Porsche commits to go racing, they never go in half committed. It's always 110%. Their goal is to make the best possible road car into the best possible race car. In order to do that, you gotta make a bunch of homologation versions. And if you want to have the best race car, you gotta have the best homologation versions. Enter the GT1, GT2, GT3, and GT4. Fair warning at the beginning, normally I explore the history of cars covered here in order of release, but with the complexity of the Porsche GT lineup, since we're doing the whole GT lineup, not just GT3, we're going to go in numerical order from GT1 all the way to GT4. Which means we have to start back in 1994 when the FIA reignited interest in sports car racing with the new GT Championship. And naturally, Porsche won in on it. Unfortunately, their 911 GT2 EVA, which I'll get to in a second, was not competitive and they needed a new racer. But in order to compete, you needed some road cars for homologation. Enter the 1996 911 GT1 Strada version. Yep, they literally called the car road version, which cues you into Porsche's true intentions with the GT1. It wasn't so much a road car to go racing as it was a race car begrudgingly converted for road use. So the GT1 had the front chassis and the taillights of a 993 911, and that was pretty much it. The rest of the chassis, and the water-cooled twin-turbocharged inline-six, mounted in the middle, were derived from the 962 Group C car that won 21 championships and 3 Le Mans. So it wasn't a 911 at all, really. But that didn't matter, because ironically, Porsche was beat by Porsche, specifically privateer team TWR, which was supported by Porsche, who won both Le Mans in 1996 and 1997. Even Porsche's own GT1 Evo couldn't touch the TWR prototypes. So tired of getting beaten by their privateer teams, Porsche ended that arrangement and created the GT198 for the 1998 season. And it was more in line with the Mercedes CLK GTR and especially the Toyota GT1. It was a pure race car never sold to the public, completely ditching any illusion of a 911, with a pointy aerodynamic nose and a long ducktail clamshell on the back. But it didn't seem to matter. In a field of BMW V12, CLK GTs, and Toyota GT1s, the Porsche was the slowest of the lot. But as they know, in order to win Le Mans, first you have to finish. And that's exactly what Porsche did. The GT198 was very reliable, and simply let everybody else around it break down to win their record 16th Le Mans. And as of 2022, it is the last heavy air quotes road car to win Le Mans. Now they did actually build 20 or so 911 GT1s and a single GT198 for homologation purposes, and they are still perhaps the most hardcore Porsches ever made. It was detuned to 536 horsepower, but that was still 100 more than any other Porsche up to that point, which means even at 16 feet long, it could do 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds and reach 191 miles an hour. It was also easier to do that with a 2,500 pound curb weight achieved by lightweight bodywork and having just no cabin of any kind. But the 911 GT1 died when the GT1 class died in 1998. So now that the GT1 program is all wrapped up, let's go back in time again, back to 1993. Like the GT1, the 911 GT2 was built for FIA GT2 homologation, but unlike the GT1, it was actually a 993 911, for realsies. Albeit fitted with wider plastic fenders and a massive wing, so it had the aerodynamics of a race car. But the engine was more complicated. They couldn't just shove a 962 engine in there, unfortunately, so they stuck with the 3.6-liter flat six. However, they built off of their turbocharged adventures of the 964 Turbo SLM GT, that is a name and a half, and applied the lessons learned in that failed program to the GT2. So it makes 444 horsepower and 432 torque in a car that is 400 pounds lighter than the 993 Turbo. It was another race car for the road, even with the air intakes on the wing to funnel air into the rear engine layout. And if you wanted more of a race car sensation, you could drop some more cash and the ability to drive it on the road with the Club Sport package. It had a full roll cage, 6-point racing harness, a fire extinguisher, and a kill switch. All told, they only built around 161 993 GT2s, so if you want one, you gotta shell out about $2 million. But the racing version, which is what the whole purpose of this thing was kind of forgettable. Yeah, it was nowhere near as impactful as the road car, with neither the GT2 or GT2 Evo having any noteworthy moments. Remember, that's the whole reason the GT1 came to be. So Porsche abandoned its efforts on the GT2 class, focused on the lower tier GT3. But everybody loved the GT2 road car, and Porsche aims to please. So they shifted the focus away from racing into a track version of the turbo, essentially. So the all-wheel drive was gone to save weight, along with the rear seat and the air conditioning. In their place were ceramic disc brakes, a roll cage, bigger turbos, a new intake, and a new exhaust. So it made 477 horsepower and a top speed of 196 miles an hour in a rear-wheel drive Porsche with a 6-speed manual. But thanks to its functional rear wing and other chassis tuning and whatnot, the GT2 could handle, as in a sub-8-minute lap of the Nürburgring in 2001. And it stayed in production all the way until 2005, before being discontinued and being brought back in 2007. When the GT2 came back with a vengeance, I'll tell you, power was over 500 horsepower, and it could exceed 200 miles an hour. And with those speeds and G-forces in the 1.1 range, the GT2 was extending into supercar territory. It was so good that driver Walter Roll took one for a public track day at the Nürburgring and set a 7-minute and 32-second lap with traffic. Sure, it was heavy by comparison at 3,200 pounds, but A, it has some of the best carbon ceramic brakes in the world, and B, you could always get the RS. In 2010, Porsche made their hardcore turbo rocket even more hardcore. Power hit 612, and weight was shaved by 150 pounds off of the GT2, thanks to carbon fiber construction and aluminum doors. It is a fearsome vehicle that forces you to respect it or face its wrath. That's probably why production was stopped for 6 years after 2012. But again, when it did come back, it was a true beast. The 991 Turbo S was already great, but the GT2 was even better because they said screw that intermediate crap and launched the GT2 in RS form only in 2018. That meant 691 horsepower and a 0 to 60 of 2.7 seconds. It's not the usual carbon fiber bits, but the new materials were added, like a magnesium roof and polyurethane aprons. And if you get the Weissach package, you get even lighter carpets, magnesium wheels, carbon fiber tie rods and roll bars, and a titanium roll cage. Either version you get gives you your signature aggressive aero, this time ripped from the GT3 Cup car. And the result of all this engineering? A Nürburgring record of 6 minutes and 47 seconds, which it held for a whole month, before the all-wheel drive SVJ Aventador beat it by 1.5 seconds in 2018. They only made 1,000 of them, and if you want the eventual 992 version, you're gonna have to wait for the GT3s to have their fun. So let's get it started. With the efforts of the GT1 and GT2 classes finished, Porsche shifted focus to the more production-oriented GT3 class. But in order to give them an edge, they still homologated the 911 with the GT3. Now, similar to the OG GT2, the 3 got better brakes, lower suspension, lightweight wheels, and downforce generating bodywork. Everybody knows this. But the big change was the engine. See, it needed to be naturally aspirated. The previous cars were turbocharged. However, a 3.6-liter flat 6 does not leave much to work with in 1999, so Porsche went back to the roots, i.e. the 962 Group C car, and based the new GT3 engine off of that, where it uses a split crankcase where the engine's crankcase is actually in line with the crankshaft. It's very technical, But this, along with a bunch of other stuff, gave the GT3 355 horsepower. That's 50 more than the naturally aspirated Carrera of the era. You could even get the free Club Sport package, they don't do that anymore, which gave you bucket seats, a roll cage, and a 6-point harness. By 2004, the GT3 was making 376 horsepower and nearly 300 torque. So despite being a naturally aspirated track star, it could still sprint to 60 in just 4.5 seconds. But Porsche wanted more. The RS came out in 2003. For the first time since 1973 in the Carrera RS, Porsche used the Rennsport moniker for an even more honed-in GT3. The windows were polycarbonate instead of glass, and the bodywork was carbon fiber. Downforce was increased by 25%. Ram air intakes were added, jumping power up to 400 horsepower in a 3,200-pound car. And that is plenty, which meant that the naturally aspirated, less powerful GT3 RS could lap the Nürburgring 4 seconds faster than its big brother, the GT2. And the 3 did get a refresh with the new 997 generation, and with it came 410 horsepower and active suspension. The RS followed suit with center-locking wheels and its 3,000-pound curb weight, and by the end of the generation it had 444 horsepower, and was as serious of a road racer as feasibly possible. So Porsche proved that in 2011 when they went to the 12 Hours of Nürburgring and entered a road-legal GT3 RS. It had the safety stuff and race tires, but that was pretty much it. They literally drove it to the track. Then, they finished 13th overall, just 9 laps down in the BMW GT3 race car, and then drove it 300 kilometers back home. Not bad. But Porsche had something very special in mind for the 997 generation send-off. A 4-liter version of their naturally aspirated flat 6. It was the biggest engine ever fitted to a 911. The thing revved to 8,500 RPM and made nearly 500 horsepower, thanks to parts straight from the RSR Le Mans racer. And it was the most powerful naturally aspirated 6-cylinder ever made, in a car weighing less than 3,000 pounds. It did 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds and was 20 seconds faster on the Nürburgring than the normal GT3. 20 seconds a lap faster. Sure, it's a big track, but that's a ridiculous margin. But then the 991 came along, and with it came some different engine choices. The standard GT3 had the 3.8-liter engine, while the 4-liter became the standard for the RS moniker. And, you know, the 3.8-liter had its initial problems. The first 800 delivered had catastrophic conrod failure, but don't doubt the 3.8-liter, okay? It's not slow, it has 470 horsepower when it works, and the first top speed above 200 miles an hour for a GT3 car. But the RS had the 4-liter engine, so it had none of those problems. Instead, its issues were from the purists, who were furious that it was now paddle shifter only, no 6-speed manual for you. Now they can whine all they want, but you can't beat around the bush that the 991 RS was a brutally quick car. The final iteration in 2019 had 510 horsepower at 9,000 RPM. Aero was again taken from the GT2 RS, with a massive rear wing and huge NACA sucking in air for the rear-mounted engine. And sure, it's rear-wheel drive, but it's got 4-wheel steering to make the turn-in even better. And magnesium rims, and silver suspension, and carbon fiber, and etc, etc, if you get the very pricey Weissach package. I think it's like $30,000 or something like that. It's crazy. So what about now? All these cars I've talked about are in the past, and we're finally, just now, getting to a car you can actually buy from a dealership right now, I think. I don't know if they sold out of them, but you can theoretically buy them right now. The 2022 GT3. And it looks pretty darn similar to the last generation, and it has basically the same engine as the last generation. So what's different about it, really? What makes it worth all the money? Well, the biggest change is the front suspension, which is finally double wishbone ripped from the RSR GTLM car. And sure, the bodywork may look similar, but it has also been redone. And when paired with the new swan neck rear wing, it makes 850 pounds of downforce. Or if I put my German glasses on for a second, 150% more than previous GT3s. That wing actually hangs from the pillars instead of resting on top of them because then the airflow is less disrupted over the airfoil. That's some sciencey stuff. And then there's the smaller stuff that Porsche is really good at, like the minute details, like wider track tires and a wider track width. All of this is to say that the rear engine, rear-wheel drive, naturally aspirated, flat six, can lap the Nürburgring in 6 minutes and 55 seconds, 2 seconds faster than a 918 hypercar. Can you imagine that? The core premise of a naturally aspirated, flat six, rear engine, rear-wheel drive dates back to 1961. Earlier, if you consider the Beetle as like the origin point with a flat four. That's insane that a technically 90-year-old design still works, and it still breaks records. And we still have the RS. It's still in testing as of right now. However, it's expected to have at least 530 horsepower and an aero kit to rival NASA. The front has been cut to pieces with massive holes and air extractors on the fenders. And the wing isn't just a swan neck. It's a swan that's taken some serious steroids. It's a biplane-style double wing with roof features that look like they're designed to funnel more air over the wing itself. And for the first time on a GT3 RS, it will have active aero. The biplane's top wing is no ordinary wing, it's actually a DRS system inspired by Formula 1 to make it even faster in a straight line. Now, DRS stands for drag reduction system, so the wing actually lowers itself, makes it smoother so the air has less resistance going over it. It seems that whenever a Porsche releases a GT3, I say the same thing, but I genuinely don't know how much farther they can push this at least 60-year-old philosophy. I mean, my next guess is a hybrid system, but even then you're starting to... I think you're stretching the limits of what can be done with a rear-engined, naturally aspirated car, and yet Porsche keeps surprising me. Now, speaking of a hybrid system, let's actually talk about some racing, because that's the whole point of this car, and we haven't talked about any of it. So in 2010, Porsche partnered with the Williams Formula 1 team to make a hybrid GT3R. The curved system powers 2 electric motors for the front wheels, giving the 911 all-wheel drive and a combined 719 horsepower. Now, as you can imagine, it couldn't really race in any specific class, but when it went to invitationals, it did exceptionally well. At the 2011 Monterey Park IMSA race, it started from last on the grid and proceeded to set the fastest lap of its class and beat every other GT car on the grid that day. That's good for starting last. That's some Carlos Sainz Ferrari level stuff. And in terms of actual racing cars that you can, compete with on a regular basis, Porsche currently competes with the RSR and the GT3R depending on the rules for each endurance series. The GT3R is used in the VLN series, which has won the 24 Hours of Nürburgring 8 times. And the RSR used at the FIA and IMSA events has also done some pretty incredible things. Now, for some context, at Le Mans, Porsche dominates lower GT Le Mans and overall. In fact, they won 7 lower-tier GT titles starting in 1999 in a row. But the top-tier GT3/GTLM crown has always been taken by Corvette or Aston Martin. Porsche's gotten the short end of the stick for the last 20 years. However, after 13 failed attempts, Porsche finally won the GTLM class of the GT3 RSR in 2013, 2018, and 2022. But more impressively, I would argue, is that GT3s have won 2 IMSA endurance races outright, beating the prototypes. In 2003, a 996 GT3 RS scored a 1-3 the 24 Hours of Daytona. As it turned out, the new Daytona prototype rules still need some tweaking. And then on a soaking wet road in Atlanta, a 911 RSR won the 2015 Petit Le Mans outright. The rear-engine layout provided the grip needed for the new Michelin wet weather tires, and that in turn allowed the 911 to close the gap on the Corvette prototypes by 10 seconds a lap, taking the outright lead and winning both the race and the championship. I've seen that video a few times on YouTube. It's honestly some of the best driving I've ever seen at IMSA. It's fantastic. Now, if you want a more guaranteed Porsche win, stop by the Porsche Carrera Cup, which is a one-night feeder series for IMSA that's been using GT3 since 1998. Now, if this were 3 years ago, that would have been the end of the video, but in June of 2019, Porsche gave the GT treatment to the 982, aka the 718, aka the Cayman. The Cayman GT4 got a hearty 6-cylinder instead of the usual inline 4 to make 420 horsepower, and like its 911 big brother, it got lightened to 3,200 pounds and sprouted all sorts of downforce adding goodies. And it has a roll cage and sticky tires much like its 911 GT counterparts. It's a fantastic car, and arguably almost better handling in its base form thanks to that mid-engine layout. But Porsche wanted more, and as a send-off to the internal combustion midship sports car, the 2021 Cayman GT4 RS launched with a near-identical GT3 engine making 493 horsepower at 9,000 RPM. It has carbon ceramic brakes to stop a foot shorter than a GT3. It accelerates to 60 in 2.8 seconds, just a tenth shy of the GT3. And it's half a minute faster at the green hell than the normal Cayman GT4. And all of this begs the question, if it's got similar specs, similar sound, similar design philosophy, and it's 20 grand less, why would you ever buy a GT3? Well, I would argue that that's not the question that you should be asking, because it's all down to personal preference. Each vehicle has a completely different driving style. One of them is a more traditional sports car layout with its mid-engine runabout style, and it's probably, maybe, the better handling of the two, the more normal, essentially. While the 911 is far more iconic, it's got the shape and it's got the handling characteristics that only a 911 can have. And you can't really put a price on that. Certainly it has a much more iconic stature than the Cayman ever will. Not saying either one of them is bad, in fact I really, really like both of them, but bear this in mind. We're comparing the Cayman GT4 RS to the new 911 GT3. The RS is still on the horizon.